Now? Oh, I think we are. Is everybody in? Yes, right. Okay, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to ISU's third annual Sir Arthur C. Clarke panel, where space meets culture. My name is Chris Welch. I'm a professor at ISU in Strasbourg, and it's my pleasure to be the moderator for this panel tonight. The purpose of the panel, which is named after the science fiction writer and our very first chancellor of ISU, is to celebrate the intersection of space and culture. Sir Arthur's work popularized space to the general public, promoted space as a kind of endeavor for exploration, for inspiration. Since that time, when he started writing, the channels for culture have expanded rapidly. We no longer just have books and text and magazines. We have social media, we have the internet. We are being live streamed now, so welcome to the people out there watching. And so our aim tonight is to invite a variety of cultural practitioners from different areas. A good example of the ISU intercultural, international and interdisciplinary approach. He's also an alumni of ISU. He is chair of the International Astronautical Federation Committee on the Cultural Utilization of Space, and has been recognized by that organization for his achievements by being given a Young Space Leader Award in 2014. He is the founding director of an organization called Cosmica, an international festival of space art and culture, and he's organized more than 20 events internationally featuring more than 180 artists, cultural practitioners, and space professionals, and that's taken place in the UK, France, Belgium, Mexico, and Canada. Recently, he is the director of what is called the Artistic Space Mission Matters of Gravity at the Yuri Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center in Russia. Moving to the left, we have Kathryn Denning. Dr. Denning is an associate professor of anthropology and a member of the Science and Technology Studies graduate program at York University in Toronto, where she teaches a variety of courses, and the one we're particularly interested in here tonight is the Anthropology of Outer Space. Her research explores scientific and popular engagements with otherness, particularly the ancient in archaeology, animals in zoos, and the alien in SETI and astrobiology. She has recently rediscovered first manuscript about outer space, the frostbitten people, was her first manuscript, which she, I think, possibly unkindly, is described in her own bio as a scientifically dubious effort involving tiny teleporting plutonians. So an early science fiction author as well as cultural studies. When she's not interested in space, she says she sometimes wanders off to investigate the undead mythical creatures and other delights for television and enjoys media outreach work, but doesn't really recommend diving with bull sharks on camera. I think we might explore that during the questions. Next to Kathryn is Alastair Reynolds. Alastair started out his career as an astrophysicist, working initially for the European Space Agency at ESTEC in Holland. While he was there, he started writing science fiction. That was when I certainly started reading his work. And as time went on, he discovered that he preferred, I think, writing science fiction to being a full-time astrophysicist, and successfully made the transition to full-time science fiction author. He is says he is sort of inspired by Arthur C. Clarke's work, and I think maybe we'll hear a little bit more about that later. And he's known for writing science fiction which tries, wherever possible, to obey the known laws of physics. So you won't find sort of hyperdrives in his science fiction. If you can get between stars, traveling slower than light in deep freeze, then that is the way it will happen. At the extreme left of the stage, from my perspective, Melanie King. She is a multidisciplinary artist and curator who has a specific focus on astronomy. She's co-director of Lumen Studios, an art collective based in London, which focuses on themes of astronomy and light in particular. Through art exhibitions and seminars, Lumen aims to raise a dialogue about how humanity understands existence. And she comes to us fresh from a series of planetarium screenings at the Blue Dot Festival, which happened in the UK just this last weekend at Jodrell Bank in Manchester. So, ladies and gentlemen, your panel. So the structure will be, I'm going to start off by asking a couple of questions of the panel to stimulate discussion, and then after that we will throw the discussion open to the floor. So if you have questions, think of them now. We have a couple of microphones which we will be passing around, and I hope that way we will spend an enjoyable, interesting and educational evening. So my first question to the panel. Oh, sorry. Absolutely, the presentations. My apologies. I'm getting ahead of myself here. We will have presentations from each of the panelists. So, Nahum, would you care to take the stage?
All right. So, Clarke? No. Okay, I need IT here, but well, I can start to talk about.
Yeah, we should wait till we can actually see the slides. Okay, I think that will enhance the experience.
Okay, perfect. So, well, I'm an artist, space artist, and I'm very interested in using our space technology as a medium, as a way for making art. The topics in my work are not necessarily about space, but it's just as most of space activities that are Earth activities. You go outside, you're in a different environment, in an extreme environment, and then you are able to look back at certain processes or certain characteristics of things that are happening in our planet. And I've been very interested in that very particular view. I started also my career as an artist, like very interested in exploring the magical sides or enchanting aspects of space exploration. So, I mean, this is a performance of, I was recreating Kepler's idea of calling a demon, the demon of Levania, to go to the moon. And I was actually conjuring. I investigated what kind of rituals he was using. But eventually, of course, Kepler was not thinking of a demon per se. He was using that idea as a poetical idea to refer to something that now we call rockets. Also, some of my practice involves giving people an intimate and personal experience of having this perspective of Earth and of ourselves. So in some of my work, I use hypnosis. And this is a group of hypnotized people. And in this particular performance, what I do is I put a group of people under hypnosis, and under that state, I put in their minds a false memory, something that never happened. And afterwards, when they wake up, they remember something new. So these sessions for remembering are about providing a space experience. So the actual memory, I mean, it's very interesting because, as you know, an artwork is always material, it's physical, and it's external, it's out there. But in this case, it's the opposite, it's immaterial because it's a memory and it's internal, it's something that you experience. So the memory that I put in people's minds is about a walk on the moon. and eventually in this memory, they remember that they were walking on the moon, and they looked at the horizon, and they can experience an Earthrise, which is Earth emerging from the horizon. And from that point of view, they are able to actually compare like the moon and how lifeless it is, and look back at our planet, have that overview effect experience, and again appreciate that we are here in a place full of life. And eventually, I mean, we did something interesting. I wanted to, because after the hypnosis sessions, I hear all the memories and people say amazing things. So I was like, oh, it would be great if they could bring something material. Like when you go on a journey, you bring like stones or postcards. I was like, what can they bring? So I started recording their brainwaves. Just because I was like, okay, I want to capture those memories. And then we did some moon bounce, you know, like you send a radio signal to the moon and then it comes back to Earth. So we were sending like these moon memories to the moon. And when they were coming back after the space journey, I started to put them on copper plates, like to see what was going to happen. And that's actually a brainwave that went to space. And then with very traditional printing techniques, I made a series of prints that actually they look like moon cartographies. So it's like the fictitious moon memory that actually went to the moon reveals something quite striking. But also, I put together space missions. This was a zero gravity space mission that we did with the Yuri Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center in Star City. And there we performed a series of parabolas. So they have this amazing cargo plane where cosmonauts and astronauts, they perform experiments and training. But we set up a series of artist studios to reflect about our experience of gravity. We always feel gravity. It's in our language, it's in our bodies. We are modeled by this force. So it's very personal. But how can you experience a different perspective of gravity if you have always felt it? So for that, you need a space mission. So we were reflecting about gravity by its absence. And then we were able to reconnect with this everyday experience. And as Chris mentioned, another thing that I do is like I direct Cosmica, which is now becoming a global institute for all the cultural, critical, and poetical aspects of space activities and their impact on Earth. It started as a series of festivals, curated festivals where we will discuss very like heated or political topics such as feminism in outer space. Only a fraction of astronautic crews are women, like 10%. But also we did some festivals about the history of alcohol, drinking alcohol in space exploration or colonialism. Also war and peace, you know, discussing all the great things that our space activities have done for peace, but also for developing war technology. And right now, Cosmica is becoming an institute that has its own projects, also to address urgent things in our planet, but all the time using this cosmic perspective. So we just started a program with refugees and immigrants. It's called Cosmica Journeys, and it's a program to reframe the concept of home and think, okay, Earth is our home, even if you have been displaced or if you have left your original home country because of whatever reasons. Also, we're doing projects about Earth without borders, how we can imagine our planet without those mental and artificial borders that we have traced. And again, you know, like when you speak with astronauts, that's the first thing that you will hear. There are no borders. Something as obvious as that. When you are here And when you're going through borders, it's not that obvious. So it's important to make a case about these ideas, and space can help us to refine. Sometimes I think that space is like a blank canvas where we can write from scratch new ways of managing ourselves, of managing territories, differences in a more sophisticated and creative ways. So all of these things we do in Cosmica. So also, it's at the end, it's a big celebration of our space activities, and that space activities themselves are cultural activities. And so you can say we have concerts and performances, and in few words, that's what I do. So thank you.
Thanks, Nahum.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Nahum. I'd like to invite Kathryn.
Thank you. But can somebody explain to me where to put my water bottle?
I'll hold it. If you need it, let me know.
Professor through and through. I want to be a space artist when I grow up.
Yeah, you should. It's fun.
Like I said, I tried fiction and I stopped when I was in grade 4 because it wasn't any good. But anyway, so I'm a professor, as you heard, and therefore I'm going to do professor things at you for about 8 to 10 minutes. Hi. Can you not do that again? It's very distracting.
Last time.
Okay, so what I thought I'd do is just throw some ideas at you about the intersection of art and space, because, and I'm doing this in a couple moments, I'm probably going to sound a little bit critical, but it's because I find that art and story are just such powerful forces in transforming the world. I believe so strongly in their potential that I want them to be used very wisely and very strategically, because I think we're at a really important time in human history. There's a lot hanging in the balance right now, and I'd like to see kind of the best of humanity throw the best of their energies into changing things around into a good direction. So the concept I want to throw at you today is the idea of metaplanetary moments. And I chose the term metaplanetary because I was trying to think about how we relate to different worlds. And to me, interplanetary didn't cut it because it kind of necessitates the idea of traveling distance between them. Metaplanetary is the term I'm floating because it just seems to capture the fuzziness that is emerging in our relationship between different worlds. So the way I define a metaplanetary moment is as a moment of profound connection and intersection, but also confusion between worlds, these moments where things like telepresence, imagination, culture, imagery, virtual reality, connections with our machines, our robots and rovers and orbiters around and on other worlds, and stories all conspire to make us feel present on another world. But I also think that there's a corollary to that, which is that we start to feel a little bit less present on our own, and precisely at a time when we need to be re-engaging deeply with Earth. So that's the concept, and I think that these moments matter because they create our understanding of what humanity is doing in outer space, and also our understanding of what we should be doing in outer space. It shapes the future of the Earth and its inhabitants, and by that I don't mean just us. We share this planet with so many other creatures and life forms, and they matter too. And also, I think metaplanetary moments matter because they shape the future of other worlds that we and our robots and our machines will eventually travel to, and any other life that might be out there. So I'll just unpack this just for a couple minutes to kind of give you some examples of what I mean, and then hopefully we can have some kind of discussion later on, either in the session or afterwards, perhaps on the bus. So I'll just give you a moment at the very beginning about where I'm coming from. That kind of explains my angle of entry, and talk a little bit in the middle about why it matters, and then a couple of examples of where culture warps science and the dominant stories of space. So the brief moment of biography, I'm very much a child of the space age in that I was born 9 months after the Apollo landings, a fact that I still have to speak with my parents about, but I think it's suspicious. And then these images show you pretty well everything you need to know about my crucial influences as a child between ages 8 and 11. So really it was Star Wars, it was Cosmos, and it was Raiders of the Lost Ark. So obviously there was a Harrison Ford crush involved in all of that, which may explain why I became an archaeologist. But also I learned a lot about human history from Carl Sagan in the Cosmos series, and I learned a way of looking at the universe. So although I was born at the time of Apollo, my mind came of age into the image of the cosmos. So That became a really interesting thing when I started to teach archaeology, because I realized one of the crucial things about our engagement with human history is that most people understand it very badly. Most of what most people believe about human history isn't true. And then when I started working in space, I found exactly the same pattern. Most of what most people believe about outer space isn't true. And as an anthropologist, that's very interesting. It's not, I mean, as an educator, that's worrying, but as an anthropologist, that's interesting. And I came to understand that the way that we imagine long ago and the way that we imagine far away, it's kind of, as you were saying, it's almost like a blank canvas upon which we project our hopes and fears, which is great, culturally speaking, very interesting, but it's worrying when we need to be engaging with reality. So that's kind of one moment of entry for me. For those of you who are educators, and anybody who's involved in education and public outreach related to space, you'll be familiar with my little list of complaints and concerns here about science literacy, even basic orientation about where we are in space, solar system distances versus galactic distances, things like this. This is quite an S-ish microphone sound. Is that any better? Just realizing you're hearing every S sound I make. Anyway, space. I find that there's an overemphasis on humans in space, and a lot of stuff from popular media I find actually can contribute to some confusion about what current human capabilities in relation to space are. So blurring of space-related fiction and fact, which is wonderful when you want to be telling stories about human adventures, but it's a little bit concerning when we're trying to think about how to create a well-educated populace who can engage critically in questions about space that are starting to concern us all. So ideas about, say, cryosleep, we're not there yet. Interstellar travel, we're not there yet. Terraforming, perhaps in some works of fiction it can occur in the space of 10 years, but even those who believe that it can be done talk about horizons of thousands of years. So all of these things become important because one of the dominant rationales for space these days is the idea that we need to create a backup world for humanity. But you need all those things in place for that to work, and we're not there yet. So these are things that I think matter. And I think it can make it hard to stay oriented about space realities, which we need to be doing in order to create a good future. So just a couple aspects of how culture, images, stories, and also our embodied practices shape our relationship to other worlds. If you think about other worlds, well, I mean, they're just there, literally in space. Yes, we send our craft between them sometimes, but there's not much of kind of a physical tether, but there are these enormous tethers and overlaps in the imagination and culture that we have. So just to run through three very quick examples from Mars, this one is going to be a very familiar one to you, Percival Lowell and the Canals of Mars. That was a collision of culture and science. Same with H.G. Wells and War of the Worlds. This one you might not know, but very much the same. The idea that the canals on Mars could only have been created by a super communist society on Mars. A lesser known work from the same era is a really glorious one, actually. But what I want to throw out to you is the idea that it's easy to kind of look back in the past and say, oh, that's culture and science bouncing off each other in a strange way, but to forget that we're doing the same thing today. So just to throw this idea out to you, when we engage, for example, in analog stations on Earth, where we pretend that we're on the surface of Mars, there's something complicated going on there. That's a collision of culture and science as well. And it's complicated and it's interesting in its culture doing what it does. Another example is the flurry of exoplanets, which are routinely being announced in the media. I mentioned this one in a lecture yesterday. So the TRAPPIST-1 system, a fantastically interesting system, and it's in so many ways. These aren't real pictures of those planets, however, they are artists' conceptions. You could be excused for thinking that they might be real images because that's so often how they're presented in the popular media. Similarly, at the very time that NASA was presenting the scientific findings, they were also presenting artistic illustrations of what it might be like to be on the surface of those worlds. As an anthropologist, I look at that and say, huh, that's interesting, because we're not going there. It's 44 light years away. So what are we doing when we're imagining that we're on the surface of that world? And I would like to suggest to you that it instantly creates this imaginary relationship with this real place. And it's kind of a distorted form of connection. It's a false familiarity. And it's also a sense of belonging there in a place that we can never get to, let alone belong in. And that's exciting when you're trying to engage with space. But I would like to suggest that it may have some kind of strange revenge effect in terms of how attached we feel to our own world when we can imagine so easily going to another one, as in the case of this travel poster for TRAPPIST-1. So the last little section that I wanted to mention was the idea of stories, narrative. We're soon going to be hearing from a fantastic writer of stories about space. But one of the most crucial stories that we tell is our own story of how we got from our first upright steps on the plains of Africa, Laetoli, to stepping literally upon the moon. How do we tell the story of that, how that occurred? How do we tell the story of how we went from throwing spears to launching satellites? It's an incredible chapter in human history. One of the most common narratives that I'm sure you recognize is the idea of manifest destiny sort of sweeping, this is the American ideology. I'm Canadian, I just wanted to mention. So the American ideology of sweeping across a continent and then kind of continuing on up into the stars. But there are a whole bunch of different ways, kind of ideas, that story themes that kind of crop up over and over again in space discourse. So the idea that, well, we should be living on the moon by now, the idea that space is our destiny, that humanity needs a frontier, that humans are born to explore, the idea that we must get off this rock if we're going to survive, and the idea that we need to be annexing the territory that's adjacent to us. So what I want to suggest to you is that when you run across these stories, flip it around, think critically about what other things come along with this story, because underneath every one of those narratives, there's a problem. And I don't have time to unpack it today, but I'm sure you can do that work for yourself. But it's just something to think about, because I think one of the things we need are some new stories of space. So just one kind of, actually two kind of last little moments here. This was a blurry snapshot from a space conference I went to a number of years ago. It was launching one of the first initiatives to think about interstellar travel. And to this day, I'm shocked by this. So they were listing these figures as kind of inspirational figures for our next stage in expanding out into the solar system. And I just find it funny because, Sir Francis Drake, no doubt a talented navigator, but he was also a pirate and a slave trader. Ferdinand Magellan is widely supposed to have been the first person to circumnavigate the Earth, but he actually never came home because he was dismembered in the Philippines. Most of his crew did not come home either, and the very few who did didn't get paid. So I kind of look at these things and I think, wow, can we choose some better role models? Can we write some new stories of space that might be a little bit more fitting for how far we have come and where we would like to go and how we would like to go? So those are just some thoughts. The last one I want to leave with you is just this, just one sentence. You all know the importance of Apollo in, obviously, space history. But this image, it's a little kind of family illustration from Greek mythology. Apollo had a sister. So I'll leave you right there with that. We can unpack that later if you wish. But my kind of parting shot then to you is just this. If you think about what Arthur C. Clarke did and what he stood for and what his legacies are, he had this dream of a hopeful, peaceful, interconnected future for all humanity. And I think that's worth striving for. He had a focus on the well-being of our own planet. His last public messages were very focused on climate change. This was 10 years ago. And you might be dismayed to see, how little progress we've made in the meantime. He was also passionate about the notion that imagining the technological future can help bring it into being. So my question then, I guess, that I would like to throw out to everybody for our discussion is, how can we stay oriented in the middle of these complex metaplanetary moments that can be so confusing? How can we tell ourselves new stories about space? What new images might inspire us? What new practices might we engage in? And how can culture and the arts bring out the best possibilities for humanity in space? So those are my questions for you.
Alastair, please take the podium.
Hello, everyone.
Yep.
Well, thank you. It's a wonderful privilege to be here. And when Chris invited me to come up with some opening remarks. The fact that it was the Arthur C. Clarke panel was a real easy fit for me, because there is no figure who has, I think, been more important in shaping the way I think about space for most of my lifetime than Arthur C. Clarke. And it's, I think, really just a series of happy coincidences that sort of brought Arthur C. Clarke into my imagination as a child. But without that, I certainly wouldn't be standing here. I would certainly never have had a career as a science fiction writer, and I probably wouldn't have gone into space science without Clarke, I think, as a sort of guiding light. I was born in Barry in South Wales, which is a small, dwindling town of some importance in the 19th century, a coal exporting town. Little known, it's close to Cardiff, which has some people have heard of. Barry wasn't on anyone's particular map, but I had a very happy childhood in Barry, and somewhere around my 7th or 8th birthday, my parents came home with a magazine, and this is an issue of that magazine, Speed and Power. This was a magazine that ran from about 1973 to 1975, so it had a very short lifespan. But it was a perfect match for me as a young boy, because it was full of geeky boy-type hardware, you know, sort of cutaway drawings of battleships and tanks and aircraft. And I lapped it up. I was absolutely obsessed with machinery, technology. Anything that moved or was powerful was of immense interest to me. But almost as a bonus, each issue near the back of the magazine carried a short story by Arthur C. Clarke. And I had never heard of Arthur C. Clarke until this point, but I read these stories, and I read them with the sort of uncritical eyes of a child. It never occurred to me that most of them were actually 30 or 40 years old even at the time. So these were reprints of sort of classic Arthur C. Clarke stories about, shall we say, the pioneering days of early space exploration. So Clarke, immediately after World War II, he sort of quickly established himself as a science fiction writer. And his stock in trade was telling very, very realistically conceived stories about exploring the solar system, establishing a human presence beyond the Earth. So a lot of Clarke's stories deal with the nuts and bolts of building space stations, living in space, living on the moon, going to Mars. And he always finds a way to, although the superficial trappings of these stories are spacecraft and spacesuits and things like that, in the most effective of these pieces, there's always a human moment. He always finds a way to connect us to the characters. And I think that sort of spoke to me even as a child. And something I'll sort of circle round to at the end, there was one particular set of stories. It was actually, it was serializing a reasonably long story over several issues. And that story was A Meeting with Medusa, which is a story, one of Clarke's later stories, in fact. It was written in about 1971, which was towards the end of his career in terms of his productivity. It was a story about an astronaut who goes ballooning into the clouds of Jupiter and encounters a sort of wonderfully imagined sort of alien ecology. And the deeper he goes into the clouds of Jupiter, the more sort of wondrous are the creatures and sort of conditions he encounters. And it really, really struck a chord with me. I mean, it blew my mind. The story was very exciting, but the illustrations that they put in the magazine were extremely vivid. And it really, I think that if there was one story that really sort of pushed me over the edge into being obsessed with not just space exploration, but with the imagination of Arthur C. Clarke, it was A Meeting with Medusa. Well, I quickly discovered that Clarke had been born very near me. So I was born in Barry, which is a little, you can just see it on the sort of southern tip of Wales, a little to the left of Cardiff. And Clarke was born in Minehead, which was only about 20 miles as the crow flies across the Bristol Channel. So I felt this sort of weird kinship in a way, a weird connection, because Clarke was from a sort of obscure town in the West Country, and I was from an obscure place in South Wales. And I thought, well, if he could make it as a science fiction writer, maybe there's hope for me. You don't have to come from Los Angeles. You don't have to be born in somewhere exciting like New York. You can come from a sort of small provincial town on the edge of the UK, and you can still become a science fiction writer. So for me, that was I kind of felt excited by that. I thought I can actually see Clarke's birthplace from Barry. Well, I read Clarke into my teens with increasing real sense of discovery going into his works. The books really opened my imagination, I think, and I found them really compelling. And they were instrumental, I think, in making me think about writing science fiction. And I started sort of writing my own sort of short stories, very much in the sort of mold of Clarke, trying to make them as realistic as possible, given that I was sort of 12, you know, so you can imagine how realistic they were. But I always felt that even as a child, I could tell that Clarke was taking pains to sort of think through the mechanics of spaceflight and psychology and the sort of, everything was very realistically rendered. But for a while, I was besotted with space, I was besotted with ideas about the future, but I didn't really know how to channel that. And I think because we're talking about culture, and we've heard contributions from people with an interest in the arts, I was also, for a while, on the course to becoming an artist. I felt that was my sort of destiny in life, if you like. The only thing that really came easily to me was painting, and that's the sort of typical sort of science fiction painting that I would have produced. And I did hundreds and hundreds of paintings of space and spaceships and planets. I was absolutely, just totally obsessed with the idea of thinking and depicting space and the future. But at some point I found that as much as I enjoyed painting, I found I could kind of there was a sort of shortcut process where if I wrote it down as a story, I could communicate what I wanted to do, for me, in a more sort of efficient way. And I started trying to write science fiction, but I never gave up the art. It was always something that I kept sort of more as a sort of hobby, even as the science fiction started becoming something I began to get paid for as I sort of grew older. Well, eventually, taking Clarke's lead, reading his fiction and his scientific non-fiction as well, which I found very interesting. And then we also heard mention of Carl Sagan, and Carl Sagan's work came along at exactly the right time to inspire me. And I started thinking about becoming a scientist. So I studied hard. I wasn't very good at mathematics, but I got my mathematics up to the point where I could sort of scrape an entry into university to do an astronomy degree. And that took me, I did my first degree, and then that took me to Scotland, and then by turns I ended up in the Netherlands working for the European Space Agency. And I did a lot of different jobs while I was working for the European Space Agency, lots of very interesting sort of different sort of scientific projects, but many of them had some connection to binary stars, which is why I've shown this illustration of a binary star. My PhD work had involved binary stars, and I found that I was often drawn back into that area of research, and it was something that was very interesting and fascinating to me. But even as I was trying to sort of establish myself as a sort of scientist and get my publications out, I was being pulled away from it by science fiction, by the sort of the terrible allure of writing as a career. And I published my first short story in 1990 in the magazine Interzone, which is a British science fiction magazine, still going. And I always say to people who have some interest in becoming writers that that's not a bad place to start, because if you can publish a short story in a science fiction magazine like Interzone, you can make a small name for yourself, and in my case I made the sort of professional contacts that 10 years later helped me sell a novel. So for me that was very important. So I carried on working at the Space Agency, but at the same time I was developing a sort of side interest in writing. And it just gradually took over. There was no sort of hard and fast point at which I became a writer rather than a scientist. It was just the one thing gradually swamped the other. I felt that I'd worked with some really bright and talented scientists, and I had this nagging feeling that I wasn't quite in their caliber. So that was a sort of feeling that was growing. But at the same time, I was really enjoying writing, and I felt that this was perhaps something that I could make a career of. So after about 3 years of writing novels, I took the decision to try and become a full-time writer. My colleagues at the Space Agency were really kind and supportive, and they helped me make that transition. So I couldn't have worked with, a nicer bunch of people in terms of me making that a little bit scary in a way, that transition to full-time writing. But once I got going on it, I never really looked back, and I've written, at least a book a year since then, 17 novels, I think, several novels worth of short stories, and I write about a book a year. Very much, I mean, it's fiction that's updated now. I've read many, many writers since Clarke. But at the same time, I think I still go back to the basic integrity of Clarke's work, which was a respect for scientific and physical knowledge, an interest in space exploration. But as has been said, and I think this is something that's very important about Clarke's work, he also had a respect for Earth. He didn't think that we would leave Earth and abandon it. He was very fond of Earth. That's something that comes through in a lot of his books and stories, a sort of basic respect for the ecosystem. So I think I took a little bit of that as well from Clarke. Well, I just wanted to end by one of the sort of happiest sort of turns of my writing career came about a few years ago, where my good friend and colleague Stephen Baxter, a very respected science fiction writer who many of you will have heard of and perhaps met, Steve had actually collaborated with Clarke when he was alive. So he had that knowledge and experience. And Steve and I discussed the possibility of writing a sequel to A Meeting with Medusa, that story that I mentioned earlier about the ballooning in the clouds of Jupiter. And we spoke to our editors, we spoke to our agents, and we got them to speak to the Arthur C. Clarke literary estate. And after some toing and froing, they said we had permission to write the novel. So Steve and I sat down and we immersed ourselves in the world of Clarke, in the imagination of Clarke. And it was a really enjoyable experience. I mean, Steve created a spreadsheet. He went back and read many, many of Clarke's works, and he sort of convinced himself that Clarke had a unifying vision of the future, an essentially optimistic, benign view of human development. And we wanted to sort of pay tribute to that. We wanted our book as well to feel Clarkean in its conception of a sort of global, united, peaceful human future. So we had a great deal of pleasure, and it was a privilege to play in Clarke's imagination. We hope we tried to do the best that we could. So that's me and my story of my life with Arthur C. Clarke. So thank you very much. Oh, and there's a bonus slide. See, so I just wanted to end by saying that I think 10 years after Clarke's death, we have prospects of people are talking seriously about Mars colonization. We could use his imagination now. I think Clarke would have something to say very, very powerfully about the pros and cons of going to Mars. He wouldn't see it in black and white terms. He would have a very nuanced and interesting take on it, I think. So I wish he were here to see what I think is a very exciting window in space exploration that's opening up for us now. Thank you. So I got 2 rounds of applause then.
None for you later then.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Alastair. I'd like to invite Melanie. Thank you.
Hello, so I'm Melanie King and I'm an artist and I'm also a curator. I thought I'd start with talking about my curational work. So I'm a co-director of Lumen Studios, and as Chris said, it's an organisation which, through exhibitions, seminars and workshops and residencies, we try to raise a dialogue about how humanity understands existence. So we look at different cultures throughout the past millennia, so Aztecs, pagans, Christians, and one of our biggest things is that we do a residency to Italy, and this year we'll be going to Castel Gandolfo to visit Guy Consolmagno, who is the astronomer and priest at the Vatican, and we'll also be visiting observatories, and the artists on the residency get to spend about 2 weeks in a studio and going on these trips and have time to reflect about different cultures and to reflect on their own artwork and their own experience within that, because a lot of these artists are from different backgrounds and international different places. So I'm also going to be talking a little bit about my research today. I'm a PhD candidate at the Royal College of Art, and my research is specifically about astronomy and visualization. So the first thing that got me into this was these Hubble images. This is actually the background of an Apple iMac, and it's the Andromeda Galaxy. And I'm particularly interested in why astronomers tend to use these highly saturated, very strong contrast, very specifically framed images. And I got into this because of an academic called Elizabeth Kessler, and she was comparing the romantic images of the American West, these paintings, and suggesting that they may have been a starting point for the visual language currently used in astronomy. So she compared these paintings specifically to Hubble images, and her point was that they're often large structures within a dominant bleak landscape, and they're often these bright colours and very vivid with strong contrast. So what I'm trying to do as an artist is to kind of be somewhere in between imagination and something direct. So I'm going to share a few artworks now. I asked Zoltan Levy at the Space Telescope Science Institute if I could make a lenticular print, which is an image which changes as you experience it. And it goes from the raw mechanical image directly from the Hubble telescope, which has the artifacts and is black and white. And it changes as you walk past it to the full colour image, which you can see here. And that was just to show people that there is quite a stark difference between those images. I also came across these beautiful images called Celesta Graphs, which were made by a Swedish playwright called August Strindberg. And what he'd expected to do was leave these photosensitive plates outside under the night sky and capture scenes of the stars. Obviously, we know now that that doesn't work like that. But what he captured were these chemical artifacts that had attached themselves through weather to the photosensitive emulsion and made images much like star fields, particularly this next one. And I really liked that term, Celesta Graph, because if you think of the etymology of the word photograph, photos means light, graphos means drawing, and a Celesta Graph would mean something that was caused from the heavens. So I've been attempting to do quite a few of those. The first one I ever did was a world record size cyanotype, which was 10 by 6 meters. And what it basically does is you coat some fabric, like a really big piece of fabric, with these photosensitive chemicals, and they're then sensitive to ultraviolet light from the sun. So what you can do is you can make these massive prints, and we really wanted to highlight that the process and coming from the sun. So we had a giant palm leaf sun in the center. We had Goan Christmas stars. So it was the Story of Light Festival in Goa. And then we had the humans taking part in the print as well, because obviously we're all part of the same universe. I've also been working with meteorites with the Royal School of Mines, crushing the meteorites into dust after taking a picture of them, and using the meteorite dust within the print to make these prints that are both photograph and actually experiencing the material itself. So you can kind of see the dust here. And I've also been working with audio interpretations of pulsars. So often pulsars, the spinning stars, are beyond the visible spectrum of light. So I wanted to make a deconstructed oscillograph. I'll show you how that works. So there's a speaker, which is playing pulsar audio interpretations, and as the mirror moves up and down, there's a laser which points and projects these drawings onto phosphorescence, and then they kind of move around and fade. And then you can also capture them by using photosensitive material, so coming back to photography yet again. So I'll go back to that. So I developed this project as well with a dark matter laboratory at Bowlby Mine in North Yorkshire, along with some other artists that are part of the Laboratory of Dark Matters project. And this one in particular was using a phosphorescent spinning disk. And what happened was that you were able to see the waveforms more clearly as the circle moved around. So to end, this is my big project that I'm working on for my PhD. I'm working with a number of different observatories to capture light directly onto photosensitive film. And what I find particularly exciting about that is the light travels thousands, if not millions of years, and then is captured onto this film. And I really like that as opposed to CCD, where information is transferred. So I'll show you a few of those images. This, you can't see it very well, but it's an analog star trail image, which is one of my first attempts. Outside Campo Catino Observatory, and it's a camera pointing up at the Milky Way, and after about a period of half an hour, the stars draw lines across the photosensitive film, much like a digital star trail, but I like the idea that you can hold something at the end of that, like holding the light. I've been working at Kielder Observatory, so this is me with my camera pointing through the telescope. And more recently, a long ongoing project with UCLO Observatory, which is the UCL Observatory in Mill Hill in London. This is the observatory, and this is the quite fitting 19th century Fry telescope I'm using, and this is one of the first images that I took, which is the stars Mizar and Alcor. I was quite happy with that. That's Arcturus, and this is one of the most successful images, so the moon captured onto photosensitive film. And this is the development in the darkroom. And just to end, one of the things that I find most exciting within both my own work and curational work is giving artists the opportunity to look through a telescope. I think it's quite a transformative experience that a lot of people don't get. So yeah, that's the end of my talk, guys.
Engages with space. Now I'm going to start off at this point by asking a question, and then I'll be coming back to you. So prepare your questions. Arthur C. Clarke was one of the founders of the British Interplanetary Society, and the motto of that august organisation, which for the sake of full transparency I should declare I'm a vice president of, so I'm biased. Its motto is "From imagination to reality." So how important is imagination for each of you in your work? So let's start with Nahum and we'll work our way across.
Well, I think imagination is I mean, it's important not only for my work but for your work as well. I think there's been a constant topic in the panel, and that is the new stories, the new narratives about space exploration. And I mean, before I was giving a workshop exactly about these ideas, and I mentioned something a little bit controversial, but I'm just going to put it on the table, and that is, for me, it's sometimes difficult to accept the fact that the most revolutionary space organization company right now has as its ultimate goal going to Mars, something that has been on the agenda for many, many years. So I wonder, where are the new ideas for space exploration? Where are we really setting the bar? I praise SpaceX, of course, but for me it's hard to believe that our imagination stops there. No, so I would love to hear the new brave, wild, new ideas. So, and that's where imagination, it's important. All the history and development of our space exploration, it's been the product of imagination. Even before we had rockets, there were some crazy ones thinking about the possibilities of doing something impossible at that given moment. So I think it's fundamental that we all embrace imagination as something essential in our field. And I'm not talking as an artist, but as someone that works in the space field, just like most of the people in this audience.
Okay, thank you. Kathryn.
That's a good one. I just keep thinking about how I want to be hypnotized into remembering that I was on the moon. It's a little hard to focus. I think for me, one of the crucial things, since I'm so interested in the future of humanity in space, is thinking about space utopias, so those ideal visions of, a perfect intergalactic future where there is no money, everybody lives in harmony, and the perfect space future I'm talking about, and the space dystopias, which are just everything is war all the time. It's very frightening. It's our worst imaginations with lasers, right? So I kind of look at those two different forms of imagination, and then I think, okay, well, what is our role in the here and now? And I think our role is imagining how to get to there instead of there, or rather, how to get in more utopian direction rather than the dystopian. And that, unfortunately, is a trickier, different kind of imagination. It's not just picturing the scenario that you want to arrive at, it's thinking about how do we get there, and what kinds of institutions need to be created, what kinds of new ways of talking to each other do we need to come up with, what new images and stories can we use to inspire us in those directions. So from that perspective, to me, imagination is everything, but it's something that we're actually not taught very much about how to do. So that's kind of my thought on that. And with that beat, I will turn it over.
Well, imagination is absolutely central to any artistic enterprise, I think. And as a writer, I couldn't function without an imagination. But I feel, for me, trying to write science fiction is a very broad church. It encompasses genre as pure entertainment, but it also has other functions, and there's no one purpose for science fiction. It can do many things, and for me, one of the interesting, challenging things it can do is to take relatively esoteric ideas from the edge of science and illuminate them in a way that helps us get a better understanding of that idea, perhaps think about it differently, and it also gives us a narrative language by which we can think about that idea in a different way than was possible before. And you can think about the way science fiction has done that in the past with things like splitting the atom, or thinking about going to the moon, technological and scientific challenges, robotics, computers. But for me, one of the trickiest things to come at is really large scale, the way sort of physics and cosmology is transforming our worldview in really profound and unsettling ways, but finding a way to relate that to the human in fictional terms is really tricky. So I always say, for me, it's like linking the personal to the cosmological. So, an example would be you'll open New Scientist and there'll be some article that reflects on some discovery about dark matter or some hypothesis about the nature of dark matter, which might have an ultimate bearing on the fate of the universe. I think, well, this is kind of interesting, cutting-edge science, but how do I dramatize that? How do I find a way to make that a piece of fiction which isn't completely dry and sterile? And occasionally, I have an insight like that. The imagination will cough up a way in which I can relate that to establish a human predicament which illuminates that larger scientific topic. And for me, when those moments happen, those are the great breakthroughs for me as a writer. I always enjoy them, but it's really challenging. And that, for me, is the big sort of hill to climb in my imagination.
Thank you, Alastair. Melanie?
I'm really interested particularly in the things that we don't know, so certain theories about dark matter, and having conversations with artists, philosophers and scientists about those kind of things and what they imagine might be the answer to those questions is something I find absolutely fascinating. So it's an important part of my work, both as an artist and trying to make up my own mind about those things through my research, and also through talking to other artists, as I said before.
Okay, thank you for that. So the panel tonight is about, obviously, space and culture. So we've covered imagination and its role. So how does that, if you like, how do you, I hesitate to use the term, how do you implement imagination in cultural activities, or maybe how do you see it kind of manifest itself?
Well, culture and imagination and space, I think, I mean, of course, I'm interested in the culture that generates from space activities, but I'm also very interested in the other way around, the culture that we are sending into our space, which sometimes it feels that for over a certain period of time, it was just a critical. There was not a critical point about this. I mean, in a way, my hypnosis performance, where people go to the moon, I did it as a kind of comment because it was striking to see that only 12 people walked on the moon and all of them were guys. There wasn't a single woman. So how are we curating that culture that we send? You know, how are we representing ourselves? What do we want to project? I mean, there's not an answer. I mean, like interstellar messaging, the Voyager, we send all the nice things about us. No? We send the music, and we send our knowledge, and the brainwaves of Carl Sagan's wife, etc. But we didn't send all the bad things that we are. So it was censored in a way, self-censored. We didn't send Hiroshima, we didn't send slavery, etc. So it's a question, what culture we're sending? How are we understanding ourselves? So it's, again, talking about perspectives, it gives us an interesting insight of what we think we are.
Kathryn?
The interstellar messaging thing is a fantastic one. I think one of my favorite ones was somebody, Alexander Zaitsev, decided that what aliens would really like to hear would be theremin concerts. So he had theremin concerts created for aliens, which he beamed up. It's just still one of my favorite messages of all time. You're right, though, about the question about what we're choosing to represent when we send, and there are a lot of people working on that question right now. For me, I think one of the most wonderful intersections of culture and space is just any one of those moments when any individual person, so you don't have to be a scientist, you don't have to be somebody who understands, say, all the technicalities of robotics, when somebody can just build a personal connection with the cosmos, with space. Those are my favorite moments. So as you were saying, when somebody looks through a telescope, and it is different than looking at an image that is taken. Look at the analog and the digital experiences. You're so right; they're different. When somebody's kid comes home, maybe from 4th grade, with a terrible sci-fi story about Plutonians, but it's that personal engagement one way or another. Star parties, where people are going out, they're connecting with each other at the same time as they're connecting with the sky. And I love those ones in particular because that's the most ancient form of human connection with the sky that there is. Just you, the dark, and your eyes, and your neighbors, and you're all there looking at the stars, telling stories. And there's something about focusing together on the same thing, that shared spectatorship. If you've experienced that, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It is transformative. It is special. In the same way as I suggested for louder, thank you, the signal. In the same way that it's a little hard to see you guys out there with the lights, sorry. I was just going to talk about analog missions briefly as well there. That's a cultural experience too. So you're dressing up in a spacesuit, you're pretending you're on another planet. Yes, there is a serious purpose to this, but it's a form of play, a form of serious play at the same time. It's a form of performance art in a sense. But what it's doing is it's building connection with that other world. It's complicated, it's not straightforward, but again, for me, it's all about connection. So us, the cosmos, other life forms, each other. That's, to me, the real strength of culture and space.
I think of the imagination as like a sort of subset of the muse. And, in creative terms, the muse can't be harnessed. You can't sit down and decide today I'm going to have a good idea. And I find, for me, struggling to sort of harness the imagination in a way that produces something beautiful is really just a question of throwing enough bricks against the wall over enough time. I can't automate the process. I can't understand it. I don't understand how the subconscious works. I just don't know that if you apply yourself to the creative process for long enough, something will happen. I mean, as a writer, for me, it's always about the intersection of two ideas that don't seem to fit together. I mean, you have a typical process is that you have an idea for a short story. What if there's a guy left behind on Mars? That would be an initial short story idea. It's not enough. And then you might spend like a year waiting for the other idea that hits that at an oblique angle and makes it function as a story. I don't know what the other idea would be, but you know it when it happens. But it's an extremely frustrating and painful process, waiting for the imagination to sort of churn its way through the subconscious and come up with something meaningful. I do think that what Kathryn was saying about there's a social responsibility for science fiction. I mean, someone said the hardest part before the space age, before the great age of Yuri Gagarin and Apollo, the big challenge was selling the public on the idea that you could that there was anything possible. You know, that you could actually put people on rockets and send them into space. This was believed to be completely fanciful. And even when people started coming around to the idea it might be possible, they couldn't accept that it would be achievable within decades. And the idea that you might have Arthur C. Clarke himself was you know, he was much more pessimistic about the moon landing in one of his books, and he puts it into the 1980s. I mean, the fact that you could do it all by the end of the 60s was just completely ludicrous to the average person in the street. The table is flipped now, and now people think that generally things that we might consider doing in space are easier than we are. And that to a degree is the fault of science fiction. It's convinced people that traveling around the solar system is easy, interstellar travel is achievable with a big switch marked hyperdrive, you know, and we can go to all these planets, we can either live on them or we can terraform them, you know, overnight. Now we have to do a very big and laborious corrective process to say, no, actually this stuff is still really difficult. Actually just building an F1 rocket engine is really difficult. I mean, the fact that we did it in the early 60s doesn't mean that it's not really difficult. And I think that's a sort of obligation that science fiction has to live up to, I think. Correct.
For me, I think the space and culture manifests itself in community and collective experience. So whether that's through exhibitions, whether it's through residencies, whether it's through trips to dark sky spaces, or whether it's to doing urban telescope sessions where people can see the moon and the planets, and all of that just leads to this kind of ongoing community where people build relationships and collaborations over time.
Okay.
Do you find that people are genuinely, I mean, my wife and I have this experience all the time, that people are just completely shocked to hear that you can see the International Space Station?
Yes, all the time.
People just don't get it. They say, oh, what do I need? What equipment do I need? Nothing. You just need to go out at the right time and look up. Oh, but I haven't got a telescope. No.
You just need to sign up to spot the station, and it'll tell you where to look.
Well, that's a moment of connection. People say, what, you mean that's the space station? And they feel really, well, I've known it happen to a few friends that they felt a real emotional connection to the space station from that point onwards. And then they always make a point of trying to see it because they've formed an emotional bond with that little thing up in the sky.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah.
Okay, the time has come now to hand over to the audience for questions. Now, I can't see you immensely kind of clearly, but I can see there's a question immediately in the front row. I think I will take a note out of a previous event where people were asked to kind of wave the screen of their mobile phone. So if you have a question, either wave your hand or wave your illuminated screen. But anyway, we have our first question here.
Thank you very much for your talk. I had a question for you about reality. Nowadays, we're very much anchored to reality. I'm guessing that to make a piece of art or write a book or do a study, it's harder these days for you to leave the country and go in the countryside and isolate yourself. And every day you're becoming much more anchored to reality than maybe you would wish. So how do you link this idea of working on imagination, on utopia, and at the same time having your cell phone, your computer, your TV reminding you of this sort of anchoring with our reality of everyday life?
Who would like to have first crack at that one?
I mean, I don't have an articulated answer, but a few weeks ago I was in the Venice Biennale and I came across Olafur Eliasson's text for his refugee project, and he said something that it moved me a lot. He said that he likes to go to these big arts exhibitions not to get away from reality, but to actually immerse deeper into reality. And I think, I like to think that art is actually about that. It's not about disengaging. It's actually about engaging more with real issues. And I think, yeah, imagination is a real issue. When we start accepting that we need it, that it's important, that it's part of building reality, then we can stop thinking of imagination as a fantastic, that existing in a fantastical realm. You know, imagination shapes reality.
So art is, so imagination is fuel not for escapism, but for exploration in terms of art.
Yeah, I think so. And in any other fields as well.
Yeah, and similarly, I would say that it isn't just a dichotomy between reality and imagination. It's a question of which reality are you engaging with, right? Because so if I decide to unplug my computer, my cell phone, leave no forwarding address, and spend 2 weeks in the woods, for example, hypothetically, like I'm just about to do, yay, that is reality. And that gives me a much closer engagement with my environment. It lets me actually listen to the birds, watch the water, and get a different feel for this precious planet that we're on. That actually takes me away from all the electromagnetic waves and the information that I'm constantly bombarded with. That it puts me into a different reality space. And it's true that it frees up some more space for creativity that you don't have when you're constantly texting and dealing with your email and those kinds of things. But yeah, I always just think of it as a different reality. It's just choosing which one is going to work for that moment. I don't know. The creative process is a different one.
Well, I mean, most writers probably will tell you the same thing, that you just need hours and hours of solitude to produce, fiction at least. And I work, I live in rural Wales. I don't have the internet where I work, deliberately actually. I live surrounded by bird song in a little cabin in my garden. And at night I go out with my telescope and I look through it and I hear, not only am I connecting with reality by looking at distant galaxies and planets with my naked eye, because I enjoy that. I enjoy the aesthetic aspect of amateur astronomy. But I also get to hear the owl that lives in the tree over the, at the end of the garden. And that, yeah, it is reality. But I'm not actually a particularly plugged in person anyway. I'm not someone who's constantly on their phone. I'm probably of that, just the last cut-off before the fully digitized generation. But for me, it's never been an issue. It's, I mean, most writing is simply hours and hours of grind. Whether you're thinking about the next 10 years or the next million years, it's still sitting down and coming up with the words and fighting your way through creative blocks, and that just needs time and a degree of solitude. So for me, it's never been a problem.
Conversely, I live in London, so I'm in the epicenter of that reality. But I similarly just find a way of just switching off, and whether that's going for a run in the park or going out and looking at the night sky, or even going into the dark room and making a picture, or even having conversations with my close friends about different things. That's a way of tuning in and kind of getting into that mind space for creative work.
Okay, next question. Who has a question? There's one over there. Okay, thank you.
Hi. So I have a question about literature in general. So most stories of the future are generally dystopias. That may be because that no one wants to spend an hour and a half watching an utopia or something like that. That might be boring. But maybe there is a deeper truth that human nature, wherever we go, we take our problems with us. So even going to space is not going to get us past the basic nature of resource acquisition, tribalism, and territorialism. Just wondering what your opinion is on that.
Sounds like a question for Alastair in the first instance.
Well, it's certainly true when you look at the sort of literature of the future. Dystopianism is I'm not sure it's the predominant strain, but it's a very strong component. It's been there for hundreds of years, actually. But there's also a countervailing point of view, which is that we need narratives that give us some reason to believe that it's actually worth staying alive as well. And particularly in these sort of troubled times. I mean, there's not just the current political situation of the world, but when we think about things like climate change, It's too easy to write a head in the sand dystopia which says that the world is going to hell in a handcart, the ocean levels are going to rise up, the atmosphere is going to become toxic, and we're all going to die. That doesn't, other than depressing everybody, it doesn't actually give us any kind of toolkits to actually address the problem. So there is a sort of slight ripple in the other direction in science fiction at the moment, where there are a number of writers and collectives of writers who are trying to think in a more positive way, not in some sort of naive utopianism, but just trying to think of broadly positive ways in which ingenuity and cooperation and just basic good sense might actually help us through this sort of bottleneck. So it can be done. The tricky thing is actually to find a way to make it engaging as fiction, because you generally need some narrative struggle to make a piece of story interesting to read. So there has to be some challenge for the protagonist to overcome. But that's not completely at odds with the idea of writing a more sort of positive view of the future.
Kathryn, what's your view as an anthropologist about our obsession with dystopias?
Yeah, that's a good one too. As an anthropologist, whenever I hear the phrase human nature, my ears go, because usually that's something that we kind of challenge, especially, for example, the idea that we're inherently good or that we're inherently bad. It's undeniably true and an excellent observation that we take our human issues with us wherever we go, and therefore space will not be immune to that. But one thing I take a lot of hope from as an archaeologist and anthropologist who spent a lot of time studying the breadth and depth of human history is that even in instances of collapse or profound change, there's also resilience. So this, for example, is something that archaeologists have been looking at over about the last 10 years. After we started to realize that, yeah, we're in a very serious climate situation and we are looking at some degree of civilizational collapse. It's going to happen, unless we find some amazing technological solutions. I mean, some cities will not survive. Water level changes, agriculture is going to change all of this. Collapse in anthropological terms or archaeological terms doesn't necessarily mean disaster or complete falling apart. It means downshifting, regrouping, and changing. So there's this focus now on resilience. What happens after a system, reaches a point of complexity that it can't sustain, downshifts? It's not as though all the people disappear. It's not as though everybody dies. I mean, obviously there are tragedies and there are difficult situations, but there's also this reality of human existence, which is that, again, people regroup, they adapt, they find another way. And when you look at that, and when you look at the history of societies that have been sustainable for thousands of years, that figured out how to live in their environments, societies that figured out mostly how to live pretty peacefully, we can see in that breadth and depth of human experience a lot of reason for hope. So although I agree we're facing some serious situations and there's a lot to be concerned about on the dystopian front, I would also say that there's reason for hope, really, really reason for hope. So if we look to those aspects of the human experience, look to our capacity to learn, to change, to be intentional, I mean, that's what we have as humans that really very few other species can manifest, is that ability to deliberate, decide what we're going to do, learn how to talk better together, make collective decisions, and implement change. It can be done. I mean, we're all witnesses to it right here, right now. So that's kind of my answer to the dystopia. It's like, yeah, be afraid of the dystopia, but don't choose it. Choose another way.
Okay, another question. We have one right down here in the front, and then we'll come back there.
Hi. I just wanted to ask the panel how they've been influenced by science fiction movies, and maybe in particular iconic films like 2001 and Alien.
So, who wants to first go at science fiction films? Good things, bad things? Do you have particular favourites, particular ones that you don't like at all?
Shall I take a go?
Yes, I know.
I
know that Al has one because we used to talk about it earlier.
Last week I went to the Netherlands and I introduced one of my favourite science fiction films. So I was asked if I would introduce a film, and they were very interested in me going for an older film rather than a more recent one. I do have some films from recent years that I enjoy. But one of the films that I found myself returning to time and time again, because I think the message in it is actually still quite relevant, is The Day the Earth Stood Still, which is from 1951. And it's a film about basically about global wisdom, about wising up, about becoming more responsible and intelligent as a civilization. And the film is, you know, it's pitched right at the sort of dawn of the Cold War. The spectre of nuclear Armageddon was behind everything. But those problems haven't really gone away, and if anything, they're sort of creeping back into the agenda now. I mean, I'm of the generation that I genuinely grew up thinking I would not see the year 2000. I thought it was a dead cert that we'd be wiped out by cruise missiles long before the year 2000, and we didn't. And I think, wow, I'm still alive. It's the 21st century. It's amazing. Wow, it's like everything's possible again now. But then it's sort of coming back now, isn't it? You know, it's kind of creeping back in, the spectre of nuclear war. Well, that film to me is a very wise and sort of enlightened take on pacifism and, you know, and responsibility. And I think certain people should be made to sit in chairs and their eyelids stapled open and forced to watch that film until they get the message.
Okay, are there any films that anyone else wants to staple people's eyelids open for?
I really loved that one as well for similar reasons. I have to say, 2001, actually, when you first invited me to be part of this panel, I just thought, oh no, I hated 2001. I can't do this. Because, again, as an archaeologist, somebody who's responsible for teaching truthful things about human history, the whole idea that aliens guided human evolution is something I spend a lot of time trying to undo in my classroom. So I would like to have a private word with Arthur C. Clarke about that at some point. Say, you've made my job harder. But apart from that, obviously, it was an epic artistic masterpiece. Just that one part.
No, Melanie, any favorite films or unfavorite films?
I really liked Contact, because it seems like quite a feasible story, and the female protagonist.
I think it's the best depiction of the day-to-day life of an astronomer I've ever seen in the film.
Yeah, I would also say Contact, and something that I mentioned in the workshop before, but the fact that the reason why this extraterrestrial intelligence they sent the plans to build this machine to travel in a wormhole was to meet her father. You know, was to reconnect with what we are, with being human. And I'm a big fan of those ideas. So, yeah.
Can I just say on that note as well, I loved Arrival, and it was for similar reasons. I mean, I thought they did a spectacular job with the aliens and the whole kind of linguistic translation part. I thought, yeah, very nicely done. But I loved the fact that the story was fundamentally about love and about loss and about memory and about time. I thought that was done exquisitely. So, yeah.
Okay, so there we have some sort of panel recommendations for those films if you haven't seen them already. Now we had a question, yes, just there.
So with all the inspiration that authors like Arthur C. Clarke and different things that we've done growing up, and a lot of things you all talked about that inspired you in your life, what do you all hope and dream for now?
So there's an easy question.
What
do you hope and dream for? Who wants to go first? I think they hope and dream not to be the first person to have to answer that question.
Well, if I answer it, it'll be a political answer, you know, which I'd like more globalism, more integrationism, less separatism, you know. But you can tell where I'm going with this, can't you? Yeah. But yeah, I'd like a time machine so I can go back to June of last year. But I just see that I think that great quote of Martin Luther King about the moral arc of the universe is slow, but it bends towards justice. I think, you know, on a historical timescale, we're probably going in the right direction, but we're just going to have a few reversals along the way. And I think we're in one of those reversal phases at the moment where we're getting, you know, politics is being dominated by demagogic figures, and we're getting nationalism on the rise again. But I hope it's just a sort of blip that when they write the sort of big history book of the third millennium. It'll be that weird time back then, but then they sorted it all out. Thanks to the wise words of the ISU SSP panel, finally put people on the right track.
So, Nahum, you have a...
Of course. Everything sounds so cheesy in my mind as I say this. But, I dream. I hope that we all, as a species, we manage to appreciate the place we live in and be respectful with everything that exists in our planet. If there's something you can learn from space exploration and going to other planets, is that there's nothing like this place, and we're very privileged to have this beautiful home. And as Kathryn said, you know, when I say us, I mean not only humans, but all the living things, beings that are around. So that's the first thing, and to see each other like without those divisions, cultural divisions that we have created. So I think if we learn to be more respectful, then the next steps will be even more interesting to see and less painful to watch.
I'd like to second what both of you said, and it is difficult to come up with an answer that doesn't sound cheesy, but I guess one thing that I would just like to add to that is to say that while we're on our way to that better place, I wish for courage for everybody, because like this is a very daunting time to be alive. The scale of the problems is so enormous, and it takes a great deal of kind of courage and belief to think that you can make a difference by chipping away at it, that your everyday actions do make a difference, that the conversations that you have make a difference, that your vote makes a difference, not to put too fine a point on it. That all these things are worth doing, and it's worth it to have the courage to stay the course. And I say that as well because when we're trying to teach people about futures, it's so easy to get incredibly disheartened. And I think one of the most inspirational speakers I heard recently was Roberta Bondar, the Canadian astronaut. And she just had this wonderful phrase. She said, we can't be ashamed to be human. Humans do what we do. We dominate environments. These are my words now, not hers. But and it's easy to feel tremendous shame when you look at what we brought on the world, of the wave of mass extinctions and all of these different things. It's easy to feel shame, but it's also easy to become paralyzed by that feeling. So I think if we can find that middle ground when we say, yeah, this is what humans do. We can find a way to moderate. We can find a way to do better. We can find a way to lower our impact. But it doesn't mean that we have to hate ourselves. We can find the strength and the beauty in humanity, and then tamp down the negativity. We can find that path. So that's, I guess, what I hope for, is that we can achieve those destinations and do so by kind of finding that different way to feel and different way to live.
Melanie.
I completely echo what you guys are saying, and a lot of my previous research has been about the fragility of life and about the fragility of life on Earth. And there's this beautiful Dutch Vanitas metaphor of the soap bubble as a metaphor for the brevity of life, and I think that's something that's really beautiful to think about, because it's not only fragile and it helps us to understand the fragility of our existence, but it's also something that exists for a short amount of time and is beautiful while it's there.
Okay, well, I think that's probably a good point to finish. On a positive note, while we're on a high, and to remind those of us who are with ISU, and to inform those of us who don't, about the fundamental nature of ISU, which was founded in a spirit of optimism for the good of all humanity as we move out through space. Our three I's, international, intercultural, interdisciplinary, I hope have been kind of clearly articulated and clearly demonstrated here tonight, both for the class of SSP17 and for the audience both here and those watching online. We have a small token of our appreciation for our panelists, so if I could get those brought up now.
Thank you very much for this inspiring talk today. And on behalf of the International Space University, we would like to present you this talk too. Thanks for taking time.
So, ladies and gentlemen, your panelists. Thank you very much. Thank you. So the only duty left to me as the moderator is to once again thank our distinguished panel. To tell you that after we finish here, there will be a reception outside, and you'll have the opportunity to follow up any particular points with our panelists as individuals if you want. But also to remind you, this is only one of a series of space-related events in the Summer of Space here in Cork, some of which are organised by ISU. Our next public event is our robotics competition tomorrow afternoon at CIT, and then next week we have our space policy panel. But there are also numerous other events. I hope you already know about the Blackrock Castle Centre. We've had a number of events there organised, as I say, by CIT, by the Observatory, and many, many other events. So if you haven't seen one of the Summer of Space brochures already, please pick one up before you leave outside of the foyer. Thank you very much.